so much. Now, let me welcome Tobias Ellwood now, MP for Bournemouth East, Chair of the Defence Select Committee at Westminster. Tobias, evening to you.
Good evening to you.
Tobias, what are you hoping to hear from the Prime Minister?
Well, I really want to hear some robust language. China is on the ascendancy, and I think we've been in denial of this seismic change that is coming over the hill, perhaps too caught up in domestic matters. And we need to really appreciate the huge geopolitical shift in long-term power that is taking place. You know, China is progressively going to overtake the United States globally from a technological, military, and indeed economic perspective. And we're already seeing our ability to influence China visibly diminishing. We've seen that with the repression in Hong Kong, where we could do little about it. COVID outbreak, we had no control over what happened there, with the World Health Organization unable to get in. China's been reinterpreting the World Trade Organization rules to its advantage in creating the One Belt, One Road programs, entrapping countries across the world, including Commonwealth countries, into debt traps. We've been unable to do much about any of this. And of course, then there's the Uyghurs, 1 million Muslims caught up in re-education camps. What is the world doing about it? And there isn't a strategy, a collective international strategy to stand up to this huge change that's taking place.
Right, so Tobias, if we in Britain have been too soft or too complacent to perceive China as the challenge or even the threat that it is, what are the decisions that would show you that we are on the right track?
Well, the first thing is to recognise not what China is up to, but what we've not done. There is an absence of international leadership at the moment. There's an absence of Western cohesion. Countries are more silent, more protectionist. Globalization is is diminishing. There's a major global recession looming. That, of course, doesn't help. But authoritarianism across the world is rising, and that's because we've had 30 years where we've become ever more progressively complacent. We've forgotten what we stand for, what we believe in, what we're willing to defend. And indeed, that's the reason why Russia has taken full advantage of that. When we departed from Afghanistan, we showed we no longer cared, or we had the actual staying power to defend what's important to us. So the first step is, what does the West serve? What is our purpose?
Okay, look, I mean, you make your case forcefully, Tobias, but what needs to be done? Are we talking about, I don't know, stopping Chinese investment in strategically important sectors? Are we talking about excluding China or Chinese funding from some higher education institutions? Just set it out for me.
Well, you're jumping straight into the micro. We can't have any impact on China. You know, you send the aircraft carrier through the South China Sea. That's not a change China's behavior on its own. This needs to be done as an international effort. So there needs to be, we have this convening power of getting countries around the table, looking at the challenges that are coming over the horizon that I've just spelt out, and then offering viable solutions. So having trade standards that we're willing to defend, having security standards that we're willing to defend. And the difference I can stress between this and the last Cold War that we endured is that the Soviet Union was pretty much independent, whereas China's Achilles heel is the fact that it needs to trade with the rest of the world.
Yes.
So the G7 has arguably about half the world's GDP. Why are we not standing up to China rather than allowing China to exploit our ever-wobbly international rules-based order?
Yeah.
That's where the leadership comes in, and that's Britain is actually well-placed to make a mark here.
Okay, so we're going to hear Rishi Sunak, it seems, talk about robust pragmatism when it comes to China. Isn't that a recognition that China's just too big and important a market? It's too big a global economic player to disengage from entirely. And if that's his position, isn't that true?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is what China wants us to believe, that they are too important, too big to challenge. But the trouble is with that is that our world will eventually splinter into two spheres of competing influence. There'll be those countries that end up having to operate and work and trade with China, and then there's the rest. And eventually they're going to bump into each other. So we either make some very difficult decisions now, or I'm afraid our world moves into a very dangerous place over the next couple of decades because we failed to stand up and do what's right today.
Let's talk to Jeremy Goldkorn. He's editor-in-chief of the independent news outlet The China Project. Jeremy, hi.
Hi.
Tell me, what should we see and read into these protests and demonstrations, Jeremy? I mean, they can be contagious, can't they? And we're seeing the biggest wave of demos that we've had in China.
Yes, indeed. I think the major thing to bear in mind is that this is coming after nearly 3 years of lockdowns, and which have been particularly intense in the last year. You know, in Shanghai, earlier in the year, some people were locked up in their apartment buildings for almost 3 months, sometimes without food. And this type of lockdown, very aggressive lockdown, has been happening all over the country, and they are very unpredictable. They are implemented by local government authorities, or sometimes even just the equivalent of the neighborhood watch committee that looks over a certain residential community. And they're very, very frustrating to live with. And this frustration all came to a head on Friday when at least 10 people died in a fire in a residential apartment building in Urumqi, the capital of the Xinjiang, the provincial capital of Xinjiang.
Yeah.
And so people have come out onto the streets.
And the leader, Xi Jinping, there's no way he's going to back down or give ground, is there? He has made it his stated, declared mission to repress protests.
I mean, I think it's part of the Communist Party's ruling philosophy and methodology that protests are not something that is allowed. Xi has associated himself very closely with the COVID zero policy that China is still trying to maintain, despite the rising infection rate. So it does seem impossible that he would back down. There is, something of a personality cult around him. And he is portrayed every day in the Chinese state media as infallible, essentially. So it's hard to see him backing down.
Is there anything approaching weakness in his position? And these protests are now, in many cases, directed against him personally and against the Chinese Communist Party. So a challenge to Xi's authority. Is his authority impregnable?
It's not 100% impregnable. The situation in the country right now is not very good. Aside from people's wariness of the COVID lockdowns, the economy is in the worst shape it's been in decades. And many young people are facing unemployment, dwindling savings or no savings. So it does feel like a very tense moment in China, the likes of which we haven't seen since the 1980s,
Yes.
1989. Nonetheless, the Chinese Communist Party has proved itself to be extremely resilient. And there have been several times over the last few decades when it looked like there might be something that would happen that would unseat them from power. And they've managed to muddle on through.
All right, and just lastly and very briefly, Jeremy, what is the thinking behind the Chinese zero COVID strategy? The scale of isolations and lockdowns, it's way beyond anything used in other countries.
Well, I think there are a few factors. Firstly, at the beginning of the pandemic, it was in fact very successful. While in the UK and over here in the United States, we were having millions of people dying and our normal lives were completely interrupted. In China, people were more or less getting on with their lives. They couldn't travel abroad, but aside from that, there weren't that many inconveniences. So for 2 years, it looked like a winning strategy. And all the planning that they've done about how to deal with the pandemic, I think, has come out of the idea that that was very successful. And it's no longer the case. Omicron is too infectious, and it's too difficult to keep everything locked down. So they're now facing a crisis that is in many ways of their own making, and perhaps because they're a victim of their success in the earlier period of the pandemic.
All right, Jeremy Colcorn, the editor of the China Project. Thank you. Now, Charlotte Ivers is here. Charlotte, hi.
Good evening, John.
Charlotte, can you just give us a sense of what can we expect from Rishi Sunak in his big speech after 8 o'clock, starting with China?
Well, we're expecting to hear from Rishi Sunak that the UK should take a more long-term approach to its foreign policy in order to compete with places like China. And also there'll be a focus on Russia. And what he's going to say is we need to be better at spreading our values around the world, less apologetic about doing that. And also we need to work to have a stronger economy at home in order to build our ability both to spend on defence, but also to have economic self-sufficiency at times of global crisis.
Are we going to have, I don't know, slogans that are very open to interpretation, do you reckon, Charlotte? I mean, we've had from the day of George Osborne talk of a golden age in our relations with China. Then we had Liz Truss, who was very cold about dealing with China. I mean, what will Sunak tell us that makes us much wiser?
Well, I think Sunak has taken a slightly softer approach to China than Liz Truss has. Certainly, that has been the criticism he's faced within his party. The idea that he has been softer on China because he wants to focus on trade with them rather than on competing with them. So it'll be really interesting to see what sort of tone he takes tonight. I think the major focus is going to be on Russia and on Ukraine. He's going to talk about giving up more money to Ukraine. He's going to talk about new resources for air defense and also commit to maintaining or increasing spending on Ukraine next year.